The media and the political establishment are up in arms over President Trump's quote at a briefing on Wednesday. He said, this is the quote, "We're going to have to see what happens. You know that. I've been complaining very strongly about the ballots, and the ballots are a disaster." That was in response to a question about whether he would engage in a peaceful transfer of power depending on what happens in the November election. I repeat, he said, "We're going to have to see what happens. You know that. I've been complaining very strongly about the ballots, and the ballots are a disaster." He added, "Get rid of the ballots, and you'll have a very peaceful, there won't be a transfer, frankly. There'll be a continuation. The ballots are out of control. You know it, and you know who knows it better than anyone else. The Democrats know it better than anyone else." So the media went crazy over this. The political establishment went crazy over this quote and said that Donald Trump is refusing to commit to a peaceful transfer of power. I'm Emily Jashinsky, culture editor at the Federalist. I'm here with my colleague, Kylee Zempel, assistant editor at the Federalist. We're going to break down the story for you right now and remind you yet again that the media is not paying attention to what Donald Trump is actually saying. So let's dive in.
Yeah.
Now, Kylee, at first, when I heard this quote, I wasn't processing the context of it. I was like, just say yes, you'll commit to a peaceful transfer of power. But what Donald Trump is saying is that there actually may not be a situation where we're able to just accept the election results reflexively like we normally do because of the massive amount of mail-in ballots that are expected to be sent in. There are court battles over this already in states, and it's going to be, like, we're delusional if we don't think that it's going to be difficult to verify the legitimacy of the ballots. And Donald Trump is right when he says, you know who knows it better than anyone else? The Democrats know it better than anybody else, because the left has been crying for weeks, months now, that Donald Trump is not going to oversee a free and fair election. The Third Way was quoted in Axios this morning, that's a liberal think tank, saying that Donald Trump is going to steal the election. He's going to try to steal the election. So the left has been complaining about this. And by the way, Kylee, these are the same people who have claimed that the 2016 election was, quote, hacked by Russia.
True. And also, after they've been pushing for months now, a method of voting that is demonstrably fraudulent on a small scale, and now they want to do it
vulnerable
nationally.
To fraud. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
So, well, I think what you said initially is the key. You know, you weren't interested in the context. You didn't know the context. And that's what the media is counting on, frankly. You know, they'll splice the soundbite and they'll run with the quote, "We're going to have to see what happens," and then slap that with a headline about, you know, Donald Trump refuses to say that he would, you know, peacefully transfer power. And that's what the media is counting on.
Called out. But in fairness, I didn't say a word about it until I saw the quote in its proper context. And
right.
I didn't freak out or anything because I'm just that good. No, it's because with Donald Trump, one lesson that the media has never learned is that you have to actually really, like, and to some extent it's a fault, and in some ways it helps him, but, like, you have to really look at what he's saying and not freak out about one part of a longer quote, because he speaks off the cuff, and you have to sort of, like, let him finish his thought to see what the context fully was. Again, like, sometimes that's a flaw, sometimes it's a strength, but here he says we're going to have to see what happens because of the ballots. He's specifically talking about the ballots, and he's saying that if the mail-in ballots are a problem on election night or election week, he might not just be like, oh yes, let me walk out of the White House on January 20th and give it to Joe Biden immediately when the results are called, because it's likely that there's going to be court battles. And Donald Trump, by the way, he has another quote where he said, I think this election will end up in the Supreme Court, and I think it's very important that we have 9 justices. And by the way, that's true. He says, I think it's better if you go before the election, because I think the scam that the Democrats are pulling, it's a scam. The scam will be before the United States Supreme Court. Kylee, do you think Democrats are starting to have to second guess their decision to go all in on mail-in ballots? Because there's some reporting to that extent that they're, like, kind of freaking out now that it's obvious mail-in ballots will have problems.
I think it's a mixed bag. I mean, I think that that's probably how they're feeling now that RBG is gone. For sure. But even before that, I think it's a mixed bag. You know, you have prominent Democrats telling Joe Biden that he should under no circumstances concede the election, whether he wins or loses.
Straight up saying that.
Yeah, so Hillary Clinton said it explicitly.
Third Way said, if all of the votes are counted, Joe Biden will win this election. And that's a quote from September, before this is like 2 months before the election actually takes place.
Right. So I think that that's still a prominent belief on the left, but I think people are starting to freak out a little bit because it's not clear that Joe Biden is going to win the election if it's fair. And so I think they're a little bit worried that this could backfire on them.
I mean, I'm terrified about this election week is what it's going to be because we do have a situation where the left has encouraged massive mail-in voting. And the day of the election, there's going to be all kinds of like pandemic related precautions at polling stations. But basically what that does, like we're in a situation right now that I'm not saying we're a failed state. We're not anywhere near a failed state, but this happens in failed states where the actual process of voting is so politicized that the legitimacy of it is partisan.
Right.
And that's like, I'm fairly young. I've learned recently that Kylee is much younger than me, but I just can't remember ever having this like level of anxiety just simply about our ability to process what happens when the votes are counted, and our system to be able to handle the mail-in ballots, to be able to get through the courts in a timely manner if we need them to certify results in a way that we can feel conclusive and determinative about what the final tally is.
Well, and it's just a runaway train. I mean, they set this in motion with mail-in ballots. There's no turning back on that. I mean, people have received ballots in the mail at previous addresses. I mean, like, this has been going on, and there's just no way to stop it. I mean, short of redoing the election, if people lose faith in the legitimacy of the election, I mean, how do you rectify that? It's just, they set it in motion, and here we are, you know?
So I wrote an article right as the pandemic started and the lockdown started in March about how, and again, this is because I'm just that good, about how facing a pandemic in the midst of the age of declining institutional trust is a serious danger because, and actually I think that's prescient, and again, I'm just brilliant, but I'm not, but I do think it's a really good point that what we've seen over the course of the summer and now it's bleeding into the fall is all of our institutions are so hyper partisan. They're so hyper partisan, like everyone has like a opinion depending on which political party they're in on our institutions, whether it's the damn postal service or the Supreme Court, whatever it is. We see people on the left and the right, we're in a recession. That's when people also start to mistrust institutions, as they should in a lot of these cases. And maybe we're technically formally out of a recession now, but we cannot downplay the level of economic turmoil this country is seeing. People are so frustrated with institutions and with the system that I think part of the reason we're seeing these riots is because people have been out of work. They're extremely angry at the system. And this is their sort of way of venting it. And my God, I'm terrified to know what that looks like when ballots are being counted.
Right. Well, and, you know, whether you're talking about riots, whether you're talking about the way that elections are conducted, it's really important to remember that, you know, we're setting precedents now. You know, whatever happens in this election, the pandemic will eventually end. You know, cities will at some point hopefully regain some sense of normalcy. Donald Trump won't be president forever, regardless of what happens in this election. So,
but you forget that he's a fascist dictator.
Right. Oh, right. No, but the things that we establish now as the norm will outlive these, unprecedented times that we're in right now. And we really need to guard against that.
Yeah, and that's such an interesting aspect of the Trump era is that, like, yes, Trump shatters a lot of precedents, and some of them are great, and some of them, oh man, I wish you weren't shattering that precedent. But for the most part, the precedents that he shatters are like presidential conduct on Twitter, right. Presidential threats towards Comcast, and it's not like stuff that's actually acted out, that's like totally dramatically different. And the left needs to think long and hard about whether the precedents they're shattering in their opposition to Donald Trump, like court packing threats, and whatever else they want to do are actually going to outweigh this sort of like, I would say, secondary norms that Trump shatters, which a lot I'm not happy with, but I think is like, they really have to balance it out, because I think they continue to sort of like treat Trump in a way that, breaks norms that are much worse than the ones he breaks.
Absolutely. Comparably, they're just insignificant, the norms that he's breaking. And, the left just really needs to think long and hard about what they want to establish for the future, and then also stop pinning it on President Trump. I think the American people are largely wise to seeing through a lot of these, well, as Donald Trump called it, a scam. I mean, such as mail-in voting, for instance. And so, they can continue to point at Trump and say that these are his faults and that, he's refusing to cede power. But I think the American people are starting to see through that.
Right. And again, it's about like looking at what he actually said. And what he actually said is that there are likely to be problems with mail-in voting. So he will have to see, in terms of like, I guess it depends on your interpretation of the term peaceful transfer. What he's saying is that he's not just going to accept those mail-in results if there are obvious issues with them, and the same way that we generally accept election results, because it's just totally, what we're seeing right now is going to be totally different.
Right. Well, and a lot of the times when he's handling the press or responding to questions, he tends to talk in hyperbole, and gets a little bit carried away. And you might be tempted to think that that's kind of how he was talking to this reporter. If you actually watch Trump responding to this reporter, it is a very measured response,
yeah, it is.
Very no nonsense. His voice doesn't even fluctuate. I mean, he just says it very, very deadpan to this reporter, and but very serious. And I just think it's not a big deal. What he said is very innocuous, and I think it's important that he did engage the question in the way that he did, rather than just responding in a way that was, of course, I will respect the results of the election, and not play into the games of the press, not play into the games of the left, and to engage it in a way that is legitimate.
Well, and let us not forget, by the way, this entire complaint about Trump's approach to election legitimacy is coming from people who have refused to accept, as we said earlier, the results of the 2016 election and have delegitimized that election literally for years now. So this is a joke. It's an absolute joke. It's dishonest, but it's also more than being dishonest. It's just another glaring example of the incoherence of the Trump era left. And just, I'm just scared for November at this point.
I agree.
Yeah,
I agree. And maybe December too. We'll see.
Yeah. Right. All right. Subscribe. Okay, I want to do daily caller.
Yeah,
5 minutes. 2 Daily Caller reporters were arrested by Louisville police while they were covering the riots that broke out in response to the grand jury's decision in the Breonna Taylor case. I'm Emily Jashinsky, culture editor at The Federalist. I'm here with my colleague, Kylee Zempel, assistant editor at The Federalist. Kylee, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.
Well, let's break down this story. 2 Daily Caller journalists arrested on Wednesday night as riots were breaking out in Louisville. These reporters, by the way, one of whom is Shelby Talcott, have been traveling the country and have captured some of the bravest and most important footage of anyone. And by the way, that includes the legacy media outlets, the corporate media, which have unlimited resources to document this kind of stuff. Shelby and the Caller reporters, Richie McGinnis, they have been doing some of the absolute best reporting throughout the summer and now in the fall. Up close, they were there in Kenosha when a man was shot right next to them. And Richie helped the guy. He tried to save the guy, did what he could. They have been documenting this stuff really close up. They've been doing just incredible reporting, brave reporting, and they ended up in jail last night. Their editor called the Louisville Police Department, informed them that these were journalists, which the police were told by the reporters that they were in fact reporters. They spent the night in jail. And, despite knowing full well that they were members of the media.
And there was an exemption for press that was explicit. I mean, it was written out.
Yes, the curfew. There was an exemption to the curfew.
Yeah. So the reporters had every right to be there. And like you said, I mean, these online media conservative reporters, but specifically the Caller team and a few others have been doing this work on the ground that if they were not there, I mean, we wrote about it at the Federalist. If they weren't there, we wouldn't have any of the footage that we have. We would have no idea what's really going on in Kenosha and now in Louisville and around the country. And so the fact that they're detained is remarkable.
Yeah, and they've been literally all over the country in the last 3 months. Like, they've been in Portland, they've been at some of the protests in DC, they've been in Kenosha, they were in Louisville at the first sign of trouble yesterday, which was Wednesday, to document that. And, you know, what's telling and really sad to me about this particular case is that whenever reporters are threatened or, you know, with anything as, you know, simple as a mean tweet at them, we hear the corporate media journalists, you know, you can literally hear the sound of them heading over to Twitter to complain about, you know, the erosion of our respect for the First Amendment in this country and our fast slide into an authoritarian state. But there's been so little support from the corporate media for these Daily Caller reporters. And, you know, that should be something that crosses ideological lines. Like, the Daily Caller, you know, they should have so much respect for what these reporters have done, because they have brought the truth about what's happening at these riots. And they've done it, by the way, in a very objective way. Like, they've documented what's happening, whether it's, you know, Antifa or whatever the group is. They've done a really good job of being fair about it, and they're getting nothing.
Well, and just a note on the corporate media, this is another thing I wrote about in that piece about these Caller reporters, is that if it weren't for the Caller reporters, the legacy media could not be doing the stories that they're doing. So, for instance, in Kenosha, the New York Times had a team put together a thorough timeline of what happened when there was the Kyle Rittenhouse shooting and the riots in Kenosha. And basically that was them combing through the video footage and putting together the timelines of these other reporters that were on the ground, because the New York Times reporter, when she got tired and thought it was going to be a long night, went home to sleep so that she could come back the next day.
What did she write?
She was on the New York Times podcast. I forget which one, but she noted that, you know, it was either the first night or the second night of the riots. She called the sheriff, who said that basically their men were just outgunned and outmanned, and, you know, it was going to be, that's just how things were. She said she figured that it was going to be another long night, so she went home so that she could come back the next day to report back when things were peaceful again. So, you know, not only is legacy media not giving these online journalists, you know, any support since they're being detained, but they also could not do their jobs if it weren't for these other reporters capturing the footage on the ground.
Yeah, and it reminds me of one experience I had with those guys. One is Julio Rosas, who's at Town Hall, who has also done just great work over the course of the summer and into the fall. I was covering a pretty intense night of protesting when Antifa was trying to topple the Andrew Jackson statue in Lafayette Square, north of the White House, in, like, I think it was June. And I was alone, and obviously am a woman, and the protesters, after a few hours, it was getting to be around midnight, I think, identified me, asked me where I was from, and, you know, it started to be an unsafe situation for me to be there. Those guys were out there all night. They were out there until like 3 or 4 in the morning.